Thomas Mitchell adjusted his weathered baseball cap and checked his watch. 3:45 in the afternoon. Same as always. His German shepherd, Duke, sat perfectly still beside the front door, amber eyes fixed on his master's every movement. The routine had become sacred over the past 2 years, since Thomas retired from his security job at the lumber mill. Walk time meant everything to both of them, a daily ritual that helped quiet the restless energy that still coursed through his veins, despite being 62 years old. Duke's tail swept the hardwood floor in measured strokes, betraying his excitement while maintaining the discipline Thomas had come to expect from his 4-year-old companion. The afternoon light filtered through the kitchen window of their small Montana cabin, casting long shadows across the pine walls, adorned with faded military commendations and a single framed photograph of Thomas in dress uniform, taken 35 years ago before his deployment overseas. The October air carried the sharp bite of early winter as they stepped onto the gravel path that wound through the dense forest surrounding Thomas's property. Duke fell into step beside his master without command, his massive frame moving with the fluid grace of a creature bred for both strength and intelligence. Thomas had found Duke at a military working dog retirement ceremony 3 years ago. The shepherd had served 2 tours overseas before a shrapnel injury to his left hind leg ended his active duty. Something in Duke's steady gaze had reminded Thomas of his own struggle to find purpose after leaving the service, and he'd filled out the adoption papers that same afternoon. Their bond had formed quickly, built on mutual understanding and shared experience that needed no words. Duke seemed to sense Thomas's occasional nightmares before they began, positioning himself beside the bed with quiet vigilance. In return, Thomas provided the structure and purpose Duke craved, along with the patience to help him work through his own invisible wounds. The familiar trail stretched ahead through towering pines and aspen groves, their leaves now scattered gold across the forest floor. Thomas breathed deeply, letting the crisp mountain air fill his lungs while Duke trotted alongside, occasionally pausing to investigate interesting scents but never straying far. This was their sanctuary, a place where the noise of civilization faded into the gentle whisper of wind through branches and the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. Thomas had chosen this remote location specifically for its isolation, needing space to decompress from years of hypervigilance and constant alertness. The nearest neighbor lived 5 miles down the mountain road, and the small town of Cedar Falls was another 20 minutes by truck. Here, surrounded by wilderness, both man and dog could simply exist without the weight of expectations or the need to explain their scars. Duke's injury had healed well, but Thomas noticed how the shepherd favored his left side on cold mornings, a reminder that some wounds leave permanent marks. Duke's ears suddenly snapped forward, his entire body going rigid with attention. Thomas immediately halted, recognizing the change in his companion's demeanor. In their hundreds of walks along this same route, Duke had never displayed this particular intensity. The shepherd's nostrils flared as he tested the air, his head turning slowly from left to right, while his amber eyes scanned the tree line with laser focus. A low rumble built in Duke's chest, not quite a growl, but something deeper and more primal. Thomas felt his own senses sharpen in response, military training automatically engaging as he cataloged their surroundings. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet. No bird songs, no rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, just the whisper of wind through pine needles and their own controlled breathing. Duke took 3 deliberate steps toward a dense thicket of mountain laurel, his massive head lowered and muscles coiled like springs. Whatever had captured his attention lay hidden beyond the curtain of twisted branches and autumn shadows. Without warning, Duke plunged into the thicket, his powerful frame crashing through the undergrowth with purpose. Thomas called out sharply, but the shepherd was already disappearing into the maze of thorns and fallen logs. The sound of Duke's movement grew fainter as he pushed deeper into the tangle of vegetation. Thomas had no choice but to follow, pushing aside branches that caught at his flannel shirt and scratched at his weathered hands. The thorns were relentless, tearing at his jeans and leaving thin lines of blood across his forearms, but he pressed on, guided by the occasional sound of Duke's passage ahead. The thicket was larger than he'd imagined, extending far back from the trail and growing denser with each step. Fallen trees created natural barriers that forced him to crawl beneath massive trunks slick with moss and decay. His breathing grew labored as he navigated the obstacle course, fighting to keep Duke's path in sight, while thorns pulled at his clothes and dead branches crackled beneath his weight. A sharp bark echoed through the forest, followed by Duke's distinctive whine of discovery. Thomas emerged from the thicket into a small clearing he'd never known existed, his shirt torn and arms scratched, to find Duke standing beside the rusted remains of an old pickup truck. The vehicle had been hidden for decades, its once red paint now oxidized to brown and orange, with saplings growing through gaps in its shattered windshield. Duke's nose pressed against the driver's side door, his tail rigid with excitement and concern. Thomas approached cautiously, noting how vegetation had grown around and through the truck's frame, suggesting it had been abandoned here for at least 20 years. The license plate was barely readable beneath layers of rust and moss. Duke circled the vehicle once, then sat beside the driver's door and looked directly at Thomas, a behavior he'd never displayed before. The shepherd's amber eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human in its intensity, as if he were trying to communicate something vital that his master needed to understand immediately. Thomas pulled open the driver's door with considerable effort, the hinges screaming in protest after years of neglect. The interior was a tangle of decayed fabric and rusted metal, but something glinted in the afternoon light filtering through the canopy above. Wedged between the seat and door frame was a tarnished silver locket, its chain broken but the pendant itself intact. Duke whined softly as Thomas carefully extracted the jewelry, his sensitive nose detecting scents his human companion couldn't perceive. The locket bore an intricate engraving of intertwined roses, and when Thomas pressed the tiny clasp, it opened to reveal two faded photographs. On the left was a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes, wearing what appeared to be a 1940s-style dress. On the right was a man in military uniform, his features obscured by time and moisture damage, but clearly a soldier from an earlier era. Duke pressed against Thomas's leg, sensing his master's sudden emotional shift. The photographs stirred something deep in Thomas's memory, a nagging recognition that felt just beyond his grasp. The woman's face seemed familiar in a way that made Thomas's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. He studied her features more carefully, noting the shape of her eyes and the gentle curve of her smile. Duke remained pressed against his side, offering silent support while his master processed this unexpected discovery. Thomas turned the locket over in his weathered hands, searching for any additional clues about its origin or owners. On the back was an inscription, barely legible after decades of exposure. "My heart belongs to you always, EM to RM 1943. The initials triggered another wave of recognition, and Thomas felt his breathing quicken. His grandmother's name had been Eleanor Margaret, and she'd often spoken of a lost love who never returned from the war. She'd married Thomas's grandfather in 1945, but sometimes late at night, when she thought no one was listening, she would whisper a name that sounded like Robert. Duke sensed his master's growing agitation and nudged him gently with his massive head, drawing Thomas back to the present moment. Thomas carefully closed the locket and slipped it into his pocket, but Duke showed no inclination to leave the clearing. Instead, the shepherd began a systematic search of the area around the truck, his nose pressed to the ground and his movements deliberate and focused. He paused beside a large boulder partially hidden by overgrown ferns, then began to dig with his powerful front paws. Earth and dead leaves flew behind him as he worked, his determination absolute and unwavering. Thomas watched in fascination as Duke uncovered what appeared to be the corner of a wooden box, its edges dark with age and moisture. The shepherd continued digging until he'd exposed enough of the container for Thomas to grasp it. The box was heavier than expected and sealed with a rusted padlock that crumbled at Thomas's touch. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept the contents dry, were dozens of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The top envelope bore his grandmother's maiden name in careful script, Miss Eleanor Margaret Sullivan. Duke sat back on his haunches, panting lightly from his exertion, but clearly satisfied with his discovery. With trembling fingers, Thomas untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. The paper was yellowed but intact, and the handwriting was strong and masculine. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "I think of you every moment I'm away from home. The mountains here remind me of our walks around Cedar Falls, though nothing could be as beautiful as the sight of your face when I close my eyes at night." The letter was dated October 15th, 1943, and signed "All My Love, Robert Michael." Thomas felt his knees grow weak as he realized he was holding correspondence between his grandmother and a man he'd never known existed. Duke pressed closer, as if sensing the emotional weight of this revelation. The letters detailed a passionate wartime romance, plans for marriage upon Robert's return, and growing concern as his deployment extended indefinitely. The final letter, dated March 3, 1944, spoke of dangerous assignments and uncertain futures, ending with a promise to find Eleanor no matter how long it took. Duke's tail wagged slowly as Thomas read, almost as if the loyal dog understood the significance of reuniting these lost pieces of family history. Thomas carefully rewrapped the letters and placed them back in the box along with the locket. As he prepared to leave the clearing, Duke suddenly froze. His ears pricked forward and every muscle tensed. The shepherd's lips pulled back in a silent snarl, revealing gleaming white teeth. Thomas followed Duke's gaze and saw a man emerging from the tree line on the opposite side of the clearing. The stranger was tall and lean, wearing expensive hiking gear that seemed out of place in this remote location. His eyes were cold and calculating as they took in Thomas, Duke, and the wooden box. Something about the man's demeanor immediately put Thomas on edge, triggering the same instincts that had kept him alive during his military service. Duke positioned himself between Thomas and the stranger, his massive frame coiled and ready to spring into action. The man's hands remained visible, but Thomas noticed how his right hand hovered near the pocket of his jacket in a way that suggested concealed weaponry. The forest around them remained unnaturally silent, as if even the wildlife sensed approaching danger. "Afternoon," the stranger called out, his voice carrying a false friendliness that made Duke's hackles rise. "Beautiful day for a hike, isn't it?" He took several steps closer, seemingly oblivious to the German shepherd's obvious hostility. "I'm Marcus Kellerman, and I've been exploring these woods for weeks looking for something that belongs to my family. That box you're holding might be exactly what I need." Thomas felt every nerve in his body come alive with alertness. Something about this man was fundamentally wrong, and Duke's reaction confirmed his suspicions. The shepherd rarely displayed aggression toward strangers, but his current posture suggested he viewed Kellerman as a genuine threat. Thomas shifted the wooden box to his left arm, keeping his right hand free while maintaining eye contact with the approaching figure. Duke's low growl finally broke free, a sound that would have sent most people backing away immediately. Instead, Kellerman smiled, revealing teeth that were too perfect and eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. "That's quite a dog you have there," Kellerman continued, now standing only 20 feet away. German shepherds can be so unpredictable, can't they? Especially the ones with military training. The comment sent ice through Thomas's veins. There was no way a casual hiker could know Duke's background just by looking at him. Duke's growl deepened, and Thomas could feel the tension radiating from his companion's powerful frame. "You seem to know a lot about my dog," Thomas replied carefully, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his system. "And you mentioned that box belongs to your family. Care to explain how you know what's inside it?" Kellerman's false smile faltered slightly, replaced by an expression of cold calculation. "Let's just say I've been looking for those letters for a very long time. They contain information that could be embarrassing to certain people, and I'm prepared to pay handsomely for their return." Duke took a step forward, his amber eyes never leaving Kellerman's face. The shepherd's instincts were screaming danger, and Thomas had learned to trust those instincts completely. "These letters belonged to my grandmother," Thomas said firmly, taking a step backward while keeping the stranger in sight. "If they're family documents, then they're staying with family." Kellerman's mask of civility finally dropped entirely, revealing something cold and predatory beneath. "Your grandmother was a foolish woman who kept documents that could destroy reputations and fortunes. Those letters prove that Robert Michael discovered something he shouldn't have during his final mission, something that certain people went to great lengths to keep buried." The man's right hand moved toward his jacket pocket with deliberate slowness. "I represent interests that have been protecting this secret for 70 years, and we're not about to let some sentimental old soldier and his dog interfere now." Duke's response was immediate and decisive. The shepherd launched himself forward with explosive power, covering the distance to Kellerman in 2 massive bounds. The man stumbled backward, pulling a pistol from his jacket, but Duke's weight crashed into his chest before he could bring the weapon to bear. The impact sent both man and dog tumbling toward the edge of the clearing, where the ground dropped away into a steep ravine. Thomas heard Kellerman scream as he and Duke disappeared over the edge, followed by the crash of breaking branches and sliding rocks. Without hesitation, Thomas dropped the wooden box and ran to the precipice, his heart hammering with terror for his companion's safety. The ravine was deeper than he'd expected, perhaps 40 feet to the bottom, with steep sides covered in loose shale and scrub pine. He could see Duke's dark form moving among the rocks below, but the shepherd appeared to be injured, favoring his left side more severely than usual. Kellerman lay motionless 20 feet further down the slope, his expensive hiking gear torn and bloodied, the pistol nowhere to be seen among the scattered debris. Duke looked up at Thomas and whined, a sound that conveyed both pain and urgent warning. The shepherd was trying to stand, his powerful legs trembling with the effort, but something was clearly wrong with his left rear leg. Thomas scanned the ravine for a way down, his mind racing through possible solutions while fighting off panic at seeing Duke hurt. The sides of the ravine were too steep for a direct descent, but he spotted a game trail that switchbacked along the eastern wall. It would take precious time he wasn't sure they had, but it was the only viable option. As he prepared to start the treacherous descent, movement caught his eye from the western ridge. 3 more figures were emerging from the forest, moving with military precision toward his location. These weren't casual hikers either. Their coordinated approach and tactical spacing screamed professional threat assessment. Duke had somehow detected their presence before anyone else, leading to the confrontation that now left him trapped and injured at the bottom of a ravine. Thomas realized with growing dread that Kellerman hadn't been working alone, and his companions were now closing in to finish whatever mission had brought them to this remote location. The wooden box of letters had become more than family history. It was apparently evidence of something important enough to kill for. The descent into the ravine tested every muscle in Thomas's 62-year-old body. But desperation drove him forward over loose rocks and through grasping thorns. Each step sent small avalanches of shale cascading toward the bottom, announcing his position to anyone listening. Duke's whining grew more urgent as Thomas approached, and the shepherd attempted to drag himself toward his master despite his obvious injuries. Blood matted the fur on Duke's left rear leg, and his breathing was shallow and rapid, indicating possible internal trauma from the fall. Thomas reached his companion and dropped to his knees, running experienced hands over Duke's frame to assess the damage. The leg appeared broken, twisted at an unnatural angle, and there were multiple lacerations across the shepherd's ribs and shoulders. Duke's eyes remained alert and focused, but Thomas could see the pain written in every line of his loyal friend's face. Kellerman remained unconscious nearby, his breathing barely perceptible, and a pool of blood spreading beneath his head. Whatever secrets he'd been protecting would have to wait while Thomas figured out how to save his dog's life. Voices echoed from above, confirming Thomas's worst fears about reinforcements. The three figures he'd spotted were now at the rim of the ravine, and their conversation carried clearly in the still mountain air. Kellerman went over the edge with the target's dog, one voice reported with cold professionalism. We need to verify the letters are destroyed and eliminate any witnesses. Thomas felt his blood run cold at the casual mention of elimination. These people were serious about protecting whatever secret his grandmother's correspondence contained, and they clearly had no intention of leaving survivors. Duke attempted to stand again, his loyalty overriding his physical limitations as he tried to position himself between Thomas and the approaching threat. The shepherd's determination was heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. Thomas gently pressed him back down, whispering reassurances while his mind raced through tactical options. They were trapped in a ravine with limited mobility, facing multiple armed opponents with military training. The situation seemed hopeless until Duke's ears perked up and he turned his massive head toward a dark opening in the ravine wall that Thomas hadn't noticed before. The cave entrance was partially hidden by an overhang of rock and twisted roots, barely large enough for a man to crawl through. Duke's keen senses had detected something Thomas had missed, possibly an air current suggesting the opening led somewhere larger. With no other options available, Thomas began the delicate process of moving his injured companion toward their only hope of concealment. Duke whined softly, but didn't resist as Thomas half-carried, half-dragged him across the rocky ground. The shepherd's weight was considerable, and his broken leg made the movement agonizing for both of them. But Thomas pressed on with grim determination. Behind them, the voices grew closer as the armed men found their own way into the ravine. Time was running out, and Thomas could hear the systematic search pattern in their movement as they worked their way toward his position. Duke seemed to understand the urgency and tried to help by using his front legs to pull himself forward, leaving a trail of blood on the stones but refusing to give up. They reached the cave opening just as the first searcher rounded a bend in the ravine wall. The cave entrance opened into a larger chamber after the initial narrow crawl, and Thomas was able to pull Duke fully inside before the mouth became visible from the ravine floor. The space was larger than expected, carved by centuries of water flow through the mountain's limestone foundation. Their breathing echoed softly off stone walls as Thomas tried to assess their surroundings in the dim light, filtering through the entrance. Duke pressed close against his side, conserving warmth and drawing comfort from human contact, despite his injuries. The shepherd's nose worked constantly, testing the air currents that moved through the cave system. Thomas could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness ahead, suggesting the cavern extended deeper into the mountain. Outside, flashlight beams began probing the shadows as their pursuers methodically searched every possible hiding spot. Duke remained perfectly still, his military training overriding his pain as he understood the need for absolute silence. Thomas held his breath as voices drew closer to their concealed position. "Check that opening," one voice commanded with military authority. "If they went to ground, that's the most likely spot." Footsteps approached across loose rock, and a powerful flashlight beam began exploring the cave mouth. Thomas pressed himself and Duke as far back as possible into the shadows, while his heart hammered loud enough to give them away. Duke's amber eyes reflected the searching light for just an instant, before the shepherd had the presence of mind to close them, eliminating the telltale glow that might betray their location. The beam played across the cave walls for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Thomas could hear the searchers breathing just outside their refuge, along with the scratch of equipment against stone as the man tried to peer deeper into the opening. Duke remained motionless despite his obvious pain, every muscle locked in perfect discipline. Finally, the light withdrew, and the footsteps moved away toward other potential hiding spots. "Nothing here," the voice reported with frustration. "The cave's too shallow, and there's no sign of passage." Thomas allowed himself to breathe again, but he knew their respite was temporary. As darkness settled over the mountain, Thomas realized they faced a new set of challenges beyond their human pursuers. Duke's injuries required immediate medical attention that he couldn't provide with bare hands and makeshift supplies. The shepherd's breathing had grown more labored, and Thomas suspected internal bleeding might be complicating the obvious broken leg. They needed to reach civilization quickly, but the armed men would certainly be watching the most direct routes back to the cabin and the main road. Duke seemed to sense his master's growing desperation and nudged Thomas's hand with his massive head, drawing attention to the air current that continued to flow from deeper within the cave system. The shepherd's nose had detected something significant about that airflow, something that might represent their salvation. Thomas had served in enough wilderness environments to know that moving air often indicated alternate exits, and Duke's keen senses had already proven invaluable in their current predicament. With no other viable options, Thomas made the difficult decision to explore deeper into the mountain's interior, carrying Duke as far as his strength would allow. The cave system proved more extensive than Thomas had imagined, with passages branching off in multiple directions as they moved away from the entrance. Duke's weight made progress slow and exhausting, but the shepherd seemed to understand their direction and occasionally lifted his head to test the air currents when they reached decision points. Thomas followed Duke's guidance, trusting the animal's superior senses to navigate the maze of stone corridors and chambers. Their passage was marked by the steady drip of water and the whisper of air movement that suggested they were following a viable route through the mountain's heart. Duke's breathing grew more shallow with each passing hour, and Thomas knew they were running out of time. The shepherd's loyalty and courage had already saved both their lives, but his injuries were becoming critical. Thomas pushed forward with desperate determination, carrying his wounded companion toward an uncertain destination while praying they would find help before Duke's strength finally failed. After what felt like an eternity of stumbling through darkness, Thomas noticed the air growing fresher and caught the faint scent of wood smoke. Duke lifted his head with renewed interest, his nostrils flaring as he detected familiar odors from the world above. The cave passage began to angle upward, and Thomas could see the faintest suggestion of light filtering down from somewhere ahead. Hope surged through his exhausted body as he realized Duke had somehow guided them toward another exit, possibly near human habitation. The shepherd's instincts and military training had proven invaluable once again, leading them through seemingly impossible terrain toward safety. As they climbed the final steep section toward the light source, Thomas could hear voices in the distance, but these sounded different from their pursuers. These voices carried the casual tone of normal conversation, rather than the clipped military precision of the armed searchers. Duke's tail managed a weak wag as they approached what appeared to be the back entrance to someone's root cellar. The voices belonged to an elderly couple, Henry and Martha Spokane, who lived in a remote homestead on the backside of the mountain. They were tending their evening fire when Thomas emerged from their storm cellar carrying a bloodied German shepherd, looking like something from a nightmare. His clothes were torn and filthy, his arms scratched and bleeding from thorns, and his face etched with exhaustion and desperation. Duke hung limply in his arms, conscious but clearly in critical condition. The Spokanes were experienced mountain people who asked no questions about how a stranger and his injured dog had appeared from their root cellar. Instead, they immediately sprang into action with the kind of practical competence that comes from decades of remote living. Martha cleared their kitchen table while Henry gathered medical supplies from their well-stocked first aid kit. They dealt with injured livestock and wildlife for 40 years, and Duke's broken leg and lacerations were within their scope of experience. Thomas finally allowed himself to collapse into a chair while the couple worked on his companion with gentle efficiency. Duke submitted to their ministrations with perfect calm, somehow understanding that these people meant no harm. Martha's weathered hands were surprisingly gentle as she cleaned his wounds and applied antibiotic ointment, while Henry fashioned a makeshift splint for the broken leg using materials from their workshop. The shepherd's eyes never left Thomas's face during the treatment, drawing strength from his master's presence, even while enduring considerable pain. Henry explained that they'd need to get Duke to a veterinarian in town as soon as possible, but his initial field treatment would stabilize the injuries for transport. Martha prepared hot soup and coffee while Thomas used their landline to call the sheriff's office, reporting armed trespassers on his property and the discovery of what might be stolen historical documents. The Spokanes listened to his abbreviated explanation with the kind of steady acceptance that marked people who'd seen their share of trouble over the years. Duke managed to lap some water from Martha's offered bowl, his appetite beginning to return as the immediate crisis passed. Sheriff Janet Morrison arrived within the hour, accompanied by a deputy and the town's veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Chen, who'd been called from her dinner to attend the emergency. The sheriff was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd dealt with various mountain mysteries during her 20-year tenure. She listened to Thomas's story with professional skepticism until he produced the wooden box of letters and explained about the armed men who'd pursued them. Dr. Chen immediately took charge of Duke's care, pronouncing the shepherd's condition serious but not life-threatening with proper treatment. The broken leg would require surgery, but the internal injuries appeared less severe than Thomas had feared. Duke's military training and excellent physical condition had helped him survive trauma that might have killed a lesser dog. As Dr. Chen prepared Duke for transport to her clinic in town, the sheriff examined the letters with growing interest. The correspondence between Eleanor and Robert Michael contained references to Robert's final mission that suggested he'd uncovered evidence of war profiteering and supply theft. The implications of Robert Michael's discoveries began to unfold as Sheriff Morrison and her deputy secured the scene around Thomas's property. The armed men had vanished, leaving behind only tire tracks and spent shell casings that suggested a significant firefight had occurred after Thomas's escape. Kellerman's body was recovered from the ravine, along with identification that linked him to a private security firm with connections to several prominent families in the region. The letters revealed that Robert had documented systematic theft of military supplies by a conspiracy of local businessmen who'd used their wartime connections to build post-war fortunes. Robert's final letter mentioned hiding additional evidence before his unit was deployed to what became their final mission, The conspiracy had apparently lasted decades, with the original perpetrator's descendants working to keep the secret buried. Duke's keen senses and protective instincts had quite literally unearthed a historical scandal that powerful people were still willing to kill to protect. Thomas realized his grandmother had kept Robert's secret for 70 years, probably never fully understanding the danger those innocent letters represented. Duke's surgery proved successful, and Dr. Chen reported that the shepherd would make a full recovery with several months of careful rehabilitation. Thomas spent every day at the clinic during Duke's initial recovery, reading aloud from newspapers and books while his companion rested in the veterinary hospital. The shepherd's eyes tracked every movement, and his tail wagged weakly whenever Thomas appeared, demonstrating once again the unbreakable bond between them. Sheriff Morrison's investigation rapidly expanded as federal authorities became interested in the historical implications of Robert Michael's evidence. The letters led to the discovery of additional documents hidden in various locations around the county, exposing a web of corruption that had influenced local politics and business for generations. Several prominent families found their carefully constructed reputations crumbling as the truth about their wartime profiteering became public knowledge. Duke had not only saved Thomas's life, but had inadvertently brought justice to crimes that had gone unpunished for 7 decades. The story of Thomas and Duke's adventure spread through the mountain community, becoming the kind of legend that people tell around fires on cold winter nights. Thomas found himself something of a local celebrity, though he deflected most of the attention to Duke's heroism and intelligence. The shepherd had demonstrated exactly the kind of courage and loyalty that made German shepherds legendary military partners. His ability to detect danger, navigate treacherous terrain, and guide his master to safety had proven that retirement from active duty hadn't diminished his capabilities one bit. If you're listening to this story from anywhere in the world, you understand the special bond between humans and the dogs who choose to share their lives with us. Thomas's grandmother finally received the closure she'd deserved for 70 years, learning that Robert Michael had died a hero's death while trying to expose corruption and protect his fellow soldiers. Share your own stories about the faithful companions who've enriched your life, because these bonds transcend species and remind us what loyalty truly means. As Duke's strength returned over the following weeks, Thomas began planning modifications to their daily routine that would accommodate his companion's permanent limitations while maintaining the physical activity both of them needed. The shepherd would always favor his left side, but his spirit remained unbroken and his protective instincts as sharp as ever. Dr. Chen suggested that Duke's military training and strong bond with Thomas had been crucial factors in his remarkable recovery. The veteran and his dog had found new purpose together, with Thomas volunteering to speak at schools about military service animals, while Duke served as a living example of courage and perseverance. Their story demonstrated how the lessons learned in service continue to shape lives long after active duty ends. The wooden box of letters found a place of honor in Thomas's cabin, alongside Duke's military commendations and a new photograph of the two heroes who'd brought a 70-year mystery to its proper conclusion. Subscribe to hear more incredible stories of courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable bonds that connect us across generations. From all of us who believe in the power of faithful companions, we salute the veterans and the dogs who serve alongside them, honoring their sacrifice and celebrating the love that makes us all better human beings. Duke and Thomas continue their daily walks through the Montana wilderness, two old soldiers finding peace in each other's company while keeping watch over the community they've chosen to protect.